Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third tranche of Vijayabhumi e-colloquium on law and economics. So far, we have had some pithy conversations with Ariel Azrachi, Maurice Stuckey, Victoria Robertson. Today, we have Professor John Kwoka with us. He has recently authored a book titled Controlling Mergers and Market Power, a program for reviving antitrust in America. The book was just released by the Competition Policy International Publishing. Let me give you a quick background before we start the conversation. An antitrust authority has three substantive roles, primarily speaking: checking the adverse effects on competition on account of anti-competitive agreements, ameliorate the abuse of dominant position, and merger control. When it comes to merger control, the jobs of a competition law enforcement authority and an astrologer have a striking similarity, that is, to predict. Merger control function is largely ex ante, while the other enforcement actions of an antitrust authority, which are on agreements on unilateral conduct, are largely ex post facto. There has been many questions since decades about the antitrust enforcement, and more so prominently taken up in the political, economic, and scholarly debate. Mergers in countless industries, rising concentration throughout the economy, and the dominance of tech giants have brought renewed attention to the role and the responsibility of antitrust policy. And to discuss these issues, today we have invited Professor John Kwoka. Let me first introduce Professor Kwoka, and then we shall start the conversation. John teaches and conducts research in the areas of industrial organization, antitrust, and regulatory economics. His emphasis is on the application of economics to current policy issues in various industries. His recent research has focused on the effectiveness of merger policy in the US. In addition to his most recent book on the subject, his earlier book, Mergers, Merger Control, and Remedies in the United States, a retrospective analysis, was published in 2015 by MIT Press. And I must make a mention that the book won the Cohen Award for the best antitrust book. One important aspect I thought will be of particular interest to the audience is that he has been co-editing the Antitrust Revolution, the leading casebook on recent antitrust cases. He has worked at the US antitrust and regulatory agencies and serves as advisor to many of them and to those several other countries and international agencies. Welcome, John. And to begin with, I want to ask you, what was your early experience with competition when you joined the profession?
So thank you for that kind introduction, Navneet. It's a pleasure to be here and to reach a wider audience. So thank you again. My interest in competition and competition policy was an outgrowth, really, of a broader interest in the way that policy affects the working of the economy. And as an industrial organization economist, I became particularly intrigued by ways that I believe the antitrust agencies in the US had not really pursued adequately the wider range of competition issues that you mentioned, price fixing, dominant firm behavior, and certainly merger policy. As you say, and over the last decade or so, I focused on merger policy. And my earlier book was an effort to document by, the subtitle had the word retrospective in it. It was documenting the past failures, the weaknesses of policy that were evident in the data that I had compiled. And it produced a template for thinking about the broad ways, the numerous ways that the antitrust agencies in the US had, in my view, failed to adequately pursue that mission. So my new book is forward-looking as opposed to retrospective. It takes the research I previously did and the research that others have done, certainly, and uses it to motivate and to describe in some detail the various ways that competition policy going forward should modify its methodology and to resurrect aspects of antitrust concern that have fallen by the wayside, and generally speaking, to tighten and toughen to make policy more vigorous and more rigorous. My objective throughout has been to bring economics to bear on these questions. So there are a lot of proposals in the U.S. and elsewhere for how to revive or resurrect or strengthen merger policy. Then my book is like I say, a broad and comprehensive approach, and one that is grounded in modern economics and evidence and theory and factual basis and in experience. And it's an effort to rethink the way that merger policy needs to be conducted.
Right. So before I invite you to deliberate on the proposals, I also want to ask you a question that, is the magic of the talisman called competition is waning? Give us a sense of the eroding state of competition. And since you have worked extensively on the U.S. economy, let's look at the eroding state of competition in the U.S. economy. How has the promise eroded in last 2 or 3 or 4 decades? Give us a sense, put things in perspective, so that we are able to make a full sense of your proposals, which you have outlined in your book.
So my book, both of them really, to some degree, as a foundational issue, describe why it is that we should be concerned about the state of competition. And my new book, in particular, tries to address criticisms of some of the common metrics. So the point here is that I argue that there are really 3 different dimensions to the argument about competition, to the concern about competition. There is, of course, data about concentration in different markets, growing concentration, declining numbers of firms. But that evidence, of course, is heavily debated and contested by some people who don't agree with the conclusion. And of course, any single bit of evidence might be subject to different interpretations. So my argument goes beyond that, and it also points out that rates of entry into markets have declined in the U.S. The total number of firms, publicly listed firms in the U.S., has been in long-term decline. So the population of firms to re-enter industries and to bring new competition to industries has really sharply decreased. And if you have rising concentration and fewer new entrants, any simple economic model will tell you that you want to look at profits to see whether, in fact, the anti-competitive effects are evident in profit data. And my study reviews the data on profits, which really shows that we have historically high rates of profit in U.S. industries, and that the high profits have really been persistent. So it's not a transient phenomenon that's brought back into the range of normal levels as a result of entry or some other measure of heightened competition. So we have, in short, rising concentration, we have reduced rates of entry, and we have high profits, confirming the fact that competition in the U.S. industries have been in long-term decline. And of course, this is evident from lots of industry experiences. Commonly cited cases are things like airlines, but also cable TV and brewing and hospitals, meatpacking, pharmaceuticals, crop seeds, home appliances, veterinary clinics, it goes on, industrial chemicals, supermarkets, mattress manufacturing. There's just a long list of industries where it's pretty clear that the number of significant players has been sharply reduced over time.
Right.
I might add, if I may just take another moment and say that this has also been true. The concern over mergers has the added dimension in the tech sector. The 5 major tech companies in the U.S. have acquired over the past 20 years nearly 700 other businesses. Now, some of them certainly are businesses that needed the backing for development and commercialization of software and needed the backing of a major tech company, but there certainly are those that not only in retrospect, but even at the time were viewed somewhat more skeptically. And they've proved the point that the vast number of mergers in that area have included a substantial number that have reduced competition there as well. So this includes, of course, Instagram and WhatsApp, but also Google DoubleClick and Waze and a large number of other acquisitions. Of those nearly 700, the two U.S. antitrust agencies have challenged and brought to court exactly one. The remedies to a handful of others, for the most part, merger investigations in the tech sector have not resulted in challenges to them. And that has, I think, created a different landscape in the tech sector as well.
Right. I think we would like to now we would like you to take us through the concrete 12 proposals which you have outlined in your book, and let's get to that so that we can then follow it up with some questions, because that's the core purpose of today's session. So over to you first. What are those proposals? You have given us a decent context now. We understand where we are coming from, but let's take a look at the 12 proposals you have developed in order to revive antitrust.
Sure. So the book, as I said, is an effort to set out a broad and comprehensive plan, not just focusing on one or two specific areas. And I do that for two reasons. I mean, one is that one contribution of the book is to underscore how broadly antitrust policy in the U.S. has weakened. So it's not just a matter of one single issue or area. And the implication of that is that any proposal or plan to revive antitrust in America must be equally comprehensive, must have equal coverage of all of the issues. So my book documents 12 substantive areas and 3 procedural issues, all of which I think need to be addressed, and I'm happy to talk about those. The other contribution of the book, as I mentioned, is that I emphasize in each case that the recommendations are supported by economics, modern economic understanding of the way that markets work and the way that policy should be used and applied to strengthen competition in these areas. So the book presents that economic evidence. Anyone who wishes to see where the recommendations come from will be able to find those in the book. In short, there are broadly 4 areas that define the 12 recommendations. So one, and I'll go through these just in a couple minutes each, is to reestablish the important role of market structure in analysis of mergers and competition. In the US and elsewhere, there's been a tendency to move away from written guidelines and the use of what's called in the US the structural presumption. But market structure remains important, and it remains critically important, and certainly in merger policy. And the merger guidelines in the US have in fact not even been enforced as written, but rather policy has fallen short of the standards that the agencies themselves agreed upon and published. In addition, the structural presumption is, as your listeners of course know, is the belief that because of the importance of market structure, that mergers that cross some threshold of concentration ought to be presumed anti-competitive. This is part of U.S. antitrust Supreme Court doctrine, but in fact, it is not widely relied on in U.S. antitrust practice. And I believe that that's an error, because the structural presumption has a good basis in economic evidence. In addition, use of a presumption rather than complicated analysis of each and every merger would relieve the antitrust agencies of the burden of proving what is in many instances quite obvious. So reestablishing the role of market structure, reemphasizing this, I think is an essential ingredient toward restoring and reviving merger control policy. Then the second category is factors that either increase or decrease concern about particular mergers. For example, I think that claims of efficiencies and other benefits often prove not to be well-founded. They simply do not transpire after the fact. I would argue that for that reason, the agency should exercise greater skepticism toward these claims, and in addition should adopt a policy of looking at mergers after they have been consummated to see whether those efficiencies in fact transpire. Similarly, claims of easy entry oftentimes are used to dismiss concern about particular mergers. After all, if entry is very easy, for a merger that reduces the population of firms by one, the argument goes, can simply be replaced by new firms. Again, with increased entry barriers and declining population of firms, that turns out not empirically to be as often the case as claimed. So those two areas, I think, need to be approached with somewhat greater skepticism. Two areas that require more attention. One of them is that increasingly, I believe it's the case that firms, whether through merger or not, create and enhance entry barriers into their markets. This has the long-term effect, maybe not the immediate effect on price, but has the long-term effect of handicapping and diminishing competition. It reduces the ability of firms to enter, of small firms to grow, of innovation to bring new products and services to consumers. And I think the rise of entry barriers is not been adequately addressed in merger enforcement. I might add, in fairness to the agencies, this is a harder issue to analyze, but I believe that the lack of attention to this really has been one of the factors that has resulted in increased market power. And the fourth of the things in that category has to do with potential competitors. The way that the law is written in the US makes it difficult to challenge mergers that eliminate a firm that is a potential entrant or a potential competitor to companies already in the market. And this may require, at least in the US, new legislation so that the agencies can pursue these more aggressively. But I think that the failure to do this in the past has resulted in a lot of mergers going through because there is not evidence of the sort that the judicial process requires and insists on in order to prove an anti-competitive effect. But the long-term result is once again to remove a considerable number of firms that might have brought competition to the markets that we now see highly concentrated. So the third category is other, as I describe it here, is other merger-related concerns. The analytical process that economists have developed with great success focuses on prices. But the result of that has been that a number of non-price concerns, I think, have not gotten adequate attention. This includes quality and choice, and certainly innovation. Now, once again, the analytical models, the economic understanding here is weaker than in the case of prices, but that is not, of course, an excuse for policy to inadequately address or pay attention to these potential anti-competitive effects. I also believe that there needs to be greater focus on monopsony power. This too is a relatively recent revelation or understanding in competition policy, but monopsony power has adversely affected worker wages in a number of local labor markets, and this is one of the anti-competitive effects that has received inadequate attention in the past. I've also spent, quite apart from this book, a fair amount of time analyzing and discussing remedies. This was one of the focuses of my previous book that you had mentioned, Navneet. because I believe that the evidence suggested that remedies were overused, often did not produce the pro-competitive effects that they were supposed to. And as a result, approving mergers subject to them in many instances did very little good in terms of restraining market power. I've been especially critical of so-called conduct remedies. These are not divestitures, but conduct remedies that seek to make firms behave in particular ways while approving the merger, seek to prevent them from engaging in certain anti-competitive practices, by creating firewalls or bans on certain other types of behavior. These are difficult to write, very difficult to enforce, and the evidence indicates not often effective. So I have quite a critical view of the use of remedies. And the fourth broad category, which will make a total of 12 recommendations, are the following three. One is that vertical mergers policy in the U.S. has been, it's only a slight exaggeration to say dormant for quite a long time, but vertical mergers do have anti-competitive effects, and the agencies have been slow, I think, to get to challenging them. Once again, these may be more difficult than horizontal mergers, but the result has been that we've seen a considerable consolidation in vertical dimension in a number of critical industries, and it is not clear that that's an outcome that we should be satisfied with. Again, there have been one or two recent challenges to vertical mergers on the part of the agencies, but again, the mixed success that they have had indicates that more work needs to be done there. A new issue that some have raised involves so-called common ownership or horizontal shareholding. This is where a hedge fund or a financial entity owns has a substantial equity interest in the major competing companies in the same industry. So a common example is financial sector firms that own significant shares of all of the four major airlines. And the argument here is that these common ownership may affect the behavior of the operating companies, that is, let's say airlines in this case, and diminish their competitive behavior against each other, because after all, their, let us say, controlling ownership interest is not for competition between the operating companies, which diminishes industry-wide profitability. This requires, in my view, somewhat more research, though it is clearly an important consideration as the financial sector penetrates more deeply into the operating sector itself. And the last issue here, which involves more than merger policy, of course, is the tech sector. And here, because the book is about mergers, I focus not on privacy issues or data issues, or even some of the behavioral issues and restraints that these companies have employed, but rather on their acquisition record and conduct. Here, as I mentioned, they have acquired Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook collectively have acquired about 700 companies since about the year 2000. And during that period of time, the agencies, while they've looked at a number of them, have chosen to subject only one of them to court challenge. And my concern is that this has removed nascent competitors, or these have involved preemptive mergers to eliminate companies that might have grown into more fulsome competitors to the major tech companies. Here too, the analytical issues identifying such a company and determining what to do are quite difficult. And in fairness to the agencies, these represent challenges that antitrust agencies, competition authorities worldwide have been wrestling with. But again, I think we should not be satisfied with the approach that we have been using, because the result of that approach has been the elimination of hundreds of potential and nascent competitors and the consolidation of substantial on the part of these companies. So those are the 12 substantive areas. And just to emphasize what I said before, this is a reflection, I think, of the broad weakening of antitrust across not just one or two or a small number of issues and areas, but the broad weakening of competition policy in a number of really important areas that need to be addressed. I also offer in the book three process or methodological recommendations, which I think are part of any package to fully revive antitrust. One of them is that the agencies, and I believe this applies to any and all agencies, should, as a routine matter, conduct more merger retrospectives. Merger retrospectives are a vast and I think largely unexploited technique for getting insights into what constitutes good decisions, good policy recommendations, and actions on the part of the agencies. I used a body of merger retrospectives that I compiled extensively in my earlier book, and it really proved to be quite illuminating, I think. And I think the agency should do this as a matter of good practice. Also, in the US, certainly, I have considerable concern about the agency's resources. The resources have been largely unchanged for about 8 or 9 years in deflated, adjusted terms. And this is while the number of mergers, and certainly the number of large mergers, has expanded considerably. So the agencies now investigate an ever smaller fraction of mergers that are reported to them in the US. I think that there is good reason to tie agency funding to some measure of the need for antitrust scrutiny. And my book has some recommendations along those lines as well. And lastly, certainly in the US, where most agency decisions end up being reviewed by a court, I think there's considerable need for education of the judiciary in modern merger economics. I think that many court decisions are made without adequate understanding of that, and as a result, we have too often, not only bad decisions, but bad law, which may affect the agency's ability to pursue other matters going forward. So in short, Navneet, that's a long list, but it is, to repeat, a long list only because I think that the weaknesses of policy to this point in time are really rather comprehensive. And I think that policy needs to not just focus on one or two of these things, but rather to view this as a rather comprehensive problem that needs to be met with a comprehensive program.
Right. That's a very quick yet comprehensive presentation on the 12 thematic areas you have identified. For those who joined us late, we are having a conversation with Professor John Kwoka of Northeastern University. He has recently authored a book titled Controlling Mergers and Market Power, a program for reviving antitrust in America. This book was recently released by Competition Policy International Publishing. After this presentation, let me encourage all the audience, which includes many competition enforcement people, former commissioners, former chairperson, and many sitting officials in the competition authorities, academics, practitioners, lawyers, economics. I would request all of you to please write your reflections, questions, observations in the chat box, and we shall be very happy to take them up for deliberation. Let me pick up a few issues for slightly greater deliberation with John. The first question I want to ask you, John, is that, the traditional, since I joined the competition profession, one of the most oft heard statement I have listened is, dominance is not bad, it's abuses. This is one of the most quoted statements I have heard. And I have always wondered, is there no sin if I'm a non-dominant entity? And if I engage myself in abusive conduct, is it not a sin? Is unilateral conduct of players which are either at the margin of market power or who possess less market power. Do you think that's an area we need to reconsider when we are considering to revive antitrust? What's your reflection on that?
It's quite clear, I think, both in economics and certainly in U.S. competition practice to have the stance that dominant firms are held to a different standard than non-dominant firms. That is, dominant firms clearly can exercise control over markets in ways that non-dominant firms cannot. So that's the first and important point, I think, because the Microsoft case in the US, I think, clearly established that foundational point. You raised the question about the non-dominant firms, whether they too can engage in practices or impose conditions on distributors or customers that may impede competition as well. And I think the answer is, of course, they can, but a different standard of proof and may be required there, because a non-dominant firm certainly will have arguably some constraints on what it can accomplish. So I view a variety of restraints by non-dominant firms as really the right way to think about them is to look for evidence of their anti-competitive effect. Because one can't use the methodology of, do they have market power, and then how do we view their behavior? How do we analyze their behavior? But rather, I think the issue is whether their behavior has demonstrable anti-competitive effects. So non-dominant firms can impose non-compete agreements, exclusive practices, shelf space allocations if it's downstream retailers, exclusive dealing arrangements, and the like. And all of these, I think, have the potential to throw frictions into the competitive market process. And as a result, some of them certainly should be subject to antitrust scrutiny for their potential anti-competitive effects. But again, the usual methodology of looking for market power and then viewing more skeptically some of their practices doesn't apply. But rather, I think the evidence really needs to focus on the effects of the practices in particular settings, because there is no broader perspective to bring to it. And that can be done. There certainly are any number of instances in the US and elsewhere where practices along the lines that I've described, have been prohibited or limited, even by non-dominant firms. So I don't think it should be a sufficient argument against such a concern that the firm is non-dominant. There certainly are any number of examples where non-dominant can impede the process of competition, and particularly to handicap growth and entry of new firms.
Right. Let's now place our attention on killer acquisitions. John, worldwide, competition authorities have a certain thresholds, and transactions which meet the threshold value and above, only those undergo certain scrutiny by the authority, right? And mergers which are below the threshold are not really scrutinized. So there are two questions I want to pose. The first one is, of course, I fully understand that if a competition authority were to scrutinize all mergers, all acquisitions, it will be practically impossible for them to really take a look at that. But let me give you a small example from India. Let's say there are two small firms which are into production of certain seeds, certain millets or cereals, right? Which are producing seed. The size of the company may be very, very small, maybe 100 million rupees or something like that. But the market share, each one of them may be having maybe massive, something like 60%, 70%. If such entities merge, they will never meet the threshold, but they very well have the potential to impact the lives of poor farmers who will be the consumers of the seeds they produce. So that's one kind of one kind of setting, one kind of market situation, which I know practically very difficult to answer. But do you see there is a practical manner of addressing these issues? And then we will come to the killer acquisitions.
So, there's two or three studies in the U.S. about how firms that lie just below the reporting thresholds have felt freer to engage in mergers and consolidation because they aren't automatically reported to the agencies. This is an interesting observation because it suggests that there is a game in some sense being played by companies that lie just below the threshold or look for potential acquisitions just below the threshold so that they can get a head start, if not actually consolidate the merger before the agencies become aware of it. So one of the concerns that I have in my book is to argue that whatever line of demarcation, whatever threshold is used, firms seemingly will play a game against that threshold so as to try to avoid reporting. And it's very difficult for the agencies to return to a consummated merger and to do much about it. There are a handful of instances where the U.S. agencies have attempted to undo consolidated mergers, but those are very infrequent. And for the most part, there's either no challenge brought or some ineffective remedy that's brought against them. So the issue of thresholds is certainly an important one. I think it's only been understood recently by examples like yours and certainly by the studies that I'm aware of in the U.S. to show how it is that the thresholds may end up obscuring a number of anti-competitive mergers. So the alternative, of course, is simply to lower the thresholds. And I don't think that to some, if done to a moderate degree, I don't think that will impose a very large additional burden on the agencies. After all, the agencies in the U.S. get reported to them about 1,500 mergers per year, and they investigate they only goes to an investigation stage for about 50. And a large number of those are resolved in ways certainly other than challenges. But the point is that for the vast majority, even of those that are reported, the agencies have no trouble in doing a triage and putting aside most of those and only examining a much smaller number, 3 or 4%, that invite further scrutiny. So a change in the thresholds would almost certainly involve a considerable number of additional mergers, almost all of which, even a higher percentage of which, don't require more than passing scrutiny and then moving on. So I don't think that changing the threshold would necessarily impose a substantial burden on the agencies. Some, but not a substantial burden. Now that we're aware of what mergers end up getting past the agencies as a result of the thresholds, that's certainly something worth reconsidering. My book also, I might add, points out that the agencies don't enforce the standards that are written. And as a result, this has, before we get to those that lie below the thresholds, it would be a good policy measure for the agencies, in fact, to enforce the standards that they themselves have adopted. My book, I might add, I didn't mention this before, documents the fact that over the past 25 years or so, that the agencies have progressively, essentially ceased enforcement actions against a wider and wider range of mergers. So rather than concentration measured by HHI, if one thinks of industries in terms of concentration measured by the number of significant firms, number of firms that matter to competition. In the US, the agencies 20, 30 years ago challenged a significant fraction of mergers that resulted in 5 firms or 6 firms. Not all of them, of course, because many of those were competitively harmless, but there was a significant rate of challenge in the range of 30 to 35% of such mergers. Over time, by about 8 years ago, the agencies had ceased all enforcement of those mergers altogether. That is to say, no longer brought any challenges against mergers that resulted in anything more than 4 firms. All those with 5 or 6, much less more numerous incumbent firms, all of those challenges had ceased. So this is why my book ties the overall weakness of antitrust policy to this rise in concentration, because merger policy has significantly narrowed, and the result, not surprisingly, is of course greater concentration and reduced rates of entry and higher rates of profit. So it's that, I think, that connects the different parts of my analysis. So the agencies, at least in the US, need, I think, to first and foremost enforce the standards that they themselves have written, rather than slipping or moving away from those, and then to adopt some measure for surveying those that lie below the threshold, so as to catch the kind of anti-competitive effect that you're describing.
Right. I'm just looking at the chat box. Former chairperson of Competition Commission of India, Mr. Dhanendra Kumar, observes that, in a particularly current situation, of course, it's an extraordinary situation created by the lockdown, where there's limited mobility and very limited choice. And at best, you can go to the street corner shop to pick up your needs. And whatever the shopkeeper passes is whatever is lying and whatever price is. So conceptually, this kind of overcharging will never ever get caught in the traditional framework of abuse of dominance. But nevertheless, this is something which will adversely hit the consumers. John, let's talk about killer acquisitions. Of course, you have in your book talked about killer acquisitions in tech sector, but from my readings, I know not just in tech sector, but in pharmaceutical sector also, a number of other high-tech sectors. One has observed, and one particular research which I can recall by Colleen Cunningham and in her colleagues Florian Edrer and Song Ma. They looked at the word of killer acquisition in the pharmaceutical sector, and they found out that killer acquisitions are both strategic and intentional, and they can overlap. There can be an overlap in the drug portfolio of target and incumbent firms. And when you set to address the killer acquisition, that can actually raise the aggregate drug project development rate. So these are some things I can remember. But taking you back to the tech sector, John, you have already listed it's a problem. But how do you really balance it out as antitrust remedy format? That's where I think we would like to benefit from your wisdom.
Yes, as you say, this is a particularly difficult, maybe uniquely difficult issue. It is an offshoot or a subcase of the potential competition argument. If one firm proposes to acquire a second firm, where the second firm is clearly in a position, has the incentive and the capability to enter the first firm's market, then that for sure raises a competitive concern, which I don't believe has been adequately pursued, but it certainly raises that concern. So the nascent competition argument, or the preemptive merger issue, or the killer acquisition issue is a step earlier than that, because it envisions a firm that is being acquired, where the acquired firm might somewhere in the future, potentially in the distant future, be able to develop a technology or a product that represents a challenge to the acquiring firm. But if the usual metrics for analyzing a potential competitor don't really work very well in that case, because the target company may not be producing any comparable or similar product, there may not be possible to find any documents that suggest they had any intention of getting into the market. And so my proposal has been, rather than focusing, as traditional methodology does, on the potential overlap of products, because I think that's too hard to envision, to think about and to focus on the capabilities and the adaptability of the technology of the target company. So, for example, if WhatsApp, at the time where Facebook acquired it, arguably had a technology that could be adapted to becoming a service like Facebook, as opposed to strictly a messaging service, to become a social media rival. If it had the functionality that would allow that, that should have raised competitive alarms. Looking for documents that said that they might want to get into the same market, whether or not those existed, which is a point people have debated, should matter less than whether they have the capability of doing that, whether the technology is fungible, adaptable to that point. Because if the target company has the ability to move into the acquiring company's business, and there is an incentive to do so, economics predicts that any company that has both the ability and the incentive to take certain actions arguably should be viewed as doing so, or certainly as potentially doing so. So my argument is that rather than turning this into the nascent competition or the killer acquisition issue, rather than turning that into a discussion about the economics of potential competition or the law on potential competition, that it should be more an engineering and operations analysis of the adaptability of the underlying technology. So that's my view in the tech sector. But as you rightly point out, the work by Florian Ederer and his colleagues focused on the pharmaceutical sector. And they showed rather alarmingly that a significant percentage of acquired companies that had overlapping products in development, those overlapping products were simply terminated, or the development projects were simply terminated as a result of the acquisition. And that's always been a concern, and their data, shows, I think, dramatically and certainly for the first time empirically, the extent of that concern. But there too, the issues could be addressed through the same lens. That is, do the companies have in development a capability that could be adapted, could be deployed to the same purpose as the acquiring company? Now, I'm not claiming that this is an easy method of analysis, but I believe it would bring attention to a somewhat different standard for what represents a killer acquisition, the elimination of a nascent competitor into some of these markets. And I think that would work okay in the pharmaceutical sector as well as in the tech sector, and arguably some others as well. Of course,
right,
over preemptive competition or nascent competitors dovetails with the analysis of innovation, does it not? And it's pretty clear that the economic models of what constitutes a competitive threat to competing innovations or innovation development is far less well developed than our analysis and our methods of analyzing price outcomes and more traditional metrics of competition. But they are crucially important. And I think that we should err really on the side of caution in allowing the rapidly moving, rapidly evolving sectors that involve high tech, pharmaceuticals or web-based services, to scoop up so many firms that in their ecosystem that arguably will have both the capability and the incentive to move into the acquiring company's core business.
Right. I'm tempted to take a question from Professor Victoria Robertson. She says that, is data concentration an issue that should be taken into account more carefully in merger control, and how? And she cites an example of the Google DoubleClick transaction where Commissioner Jones Harbour's concern was precisely with this data concentration, but she was outvoted. Do you have a remedy to address this, John?
I wished I had a quick and easy solution that would satisfy everybody, but I do not. So first off, I've looked at the Google DoubleClick merger with some care, and Commissioner Harbour's dissent it's really worth rereading, because not only with respect to data, but also with respect to the way that that DoubleClick might have evolved was in some ways virtually a roadmap to the evolution of that business, and also all of the concerns that she listed have, not all, but a large number of the concerns that she listed, in fact, have now been documented as problematic in the advertising space. So there are recently public reports on what Google and DoubleClick have done in consolidating their position there and making ever more difficult entry and competition from rival companies. And so, her dissent I use always as an example of how it is that some people, not just with hindsight, but also at the time, understood fully what the potential evolution of that business might look like and why it is that that merger was and arguably has been anti-competitive. So so that's one aspect of the data issue. I mean, the other data issue that Professor Robertson alludes to is whether data concentration raises a competitive concern quite apart from the product that may accompany the collection of data. So we're well aware, of course, that many of the tech companies and the web-based services, that what they're really producing is data to sell to advertisers and other interested parties, and that the product or service is simply a method for collecting such data, and most obviously because the product or service nominally may be free, and so we are not the customers if it is free. But anyway, the long and short of it is that consolidation of data is really one of the, I think, very important parts of the tech companies, because these have all of the attributes that concern us from a competition perspective. They're subject to vast economies of scale, first mover advantages, and the like, so that a company that occupies or has control of the largest collection of data in some ways has created an enduring advantage. So in order to deal with those issues, I think the relevant proposals have to do with opening up the data systems, that is to provide either consumers with proprietary rights or to mandate open access. The British system with respect to banking provides something of a model, I think, of how this can be done, and it's been done with some success. It's not a perfect model. The facts matter, and the facts differ with all of these. But I think it's possible to address some of these without necessarily contemplating, though some would want to do this too, without necessarily contemplating breaking up the tech companies. My own view is that the tech companies, and I argue this in the book, and the competition problems that they create can be addressed by a more aggressive approach to preemptive mergers, these nascent acquisition of nascent competitors, which we've already talked about, but also to impose substantial constraints on their behavior. That is not to dispute or to try to take apart their core business, which in many instances they've invented and are valued by customers, but rather to limit their reach and to limit the way that they affect other businesses, the way that they deploy or control crucial assets like data and the like. So that can leave Amazon and Google and their core business unaffected while limiting the behavior that represents competitive concern. And I think that some jurisdictions are farther along in doing that than others, and I think that that's a really important avenue to pursue. And it's consistent, I think, with my view that the economics to pursuing the tech sector in that method, the economic support for these measures is really quite strong. And I think
Right. And that your view resonates with Dr. Geeta Gauri, former member of the Competition Commission. She writes in the chat box that you have highlighted the difficulty of ex-ante analysis of mergers and examples of killer acquisitions and nascent acquisitions. Sometime gut instinct with a counterfactual data could be required. So there is a resonance out there. And in the interest of time, I think, and of course, I want to take up as many questions as possible. Let me quickly draw your attention and seek your very brief response to the problem of common ownership. And I think there's a number of good papers available, particularly in the civil aviation sector, where common ownership has been demonstrated as antithetical to effective competition. So a quick reflection on the case of common ownership. John, over to you.
Yes, thanks. My recommendation in the area of common ownership is that this is an area that requires more research before we actively pursue this, but it's certainly an area to keep an eye on. So the reason why I'm a little more reluctant than some of my friends and colleagues to actively pursue this is that I think that this is an economist's caution. We would like more concrete evidence. So I think that the evidence that we have is highly suggestive, but there have been concerns about some of the methodology. There have also been concerns about what the mechanism is. So, for example, most of the if one company owned a controlling interest in all four airlines, I think the common ownership issue would be transparent, would be obvious. But that's not the case. They own 5, 6, 7, 8%, and so collectively their ownership stake, really represents a minority interest. That doesn't mean that it doesn't affect the actual operation, but it does mean that it is something less than full ownership and control. So I think that there's reason to explore this, and I think that is a good recommendation on many people's part, which I endorse, to have the agencies examine this much more carefully. But I think, like with most new theories, that it is worth being sure we have it right before in taking antitrust initiatives to forestall this. I think that's normal scientific caution, but it's also the case that I think the agencies would have a very hard time in challenging these without convincing and compelling evidence. So this is a legitimate concern, and I have said so in the book, but again, my view here is more cautionary than some of my colleagues, I think, on this particular dimension.
Right. And I'm taking up a question from Mr. Subodh Dev, a well-known competition lawyer in India. His question is, how important is the analysis of non-compete provision in a merger context? Would it be a good idea to dispense with this analysis while retaining the right to look into it in the enforcement context by an agency?
I'm not sure I've understood that completely. So the issue is whether the non-compete clauses ought to be looked at as a result of a merger. Well, forgive me if I've misunderstood the question, but a clause like a non-compete clause may have considerably more anti-competitive effects as a result of a merger, because if it's in the hands of a larger company, then what it limits in the way of freedom of entry, movement, choice, and the rest will be enhanced as a result of the large footprint of a larger company. So in that sense, a non-compete clause, I think, while it could be addressed in some cases quite separate from the merger, if it arises as a result of the merger, then its potential anti-competitive effect is correspondingly larger and is, I believe, fair game for analysis within the context of merger. Let me say, if I've misunderstood the question, I invite that questioner and anybody else who's not got their question.
No, I think that was the issue.
To email me.
That was the issue, that when an agency is looking at a merger at that stage, they could dispense with this analysis and look at it later in the context of antitrust enforcement. I think I have to press the turbo button now in the interest of time, and I want to ask you as many questions as possible. So naturally, pardon me for being greedy, but that's my job as a host. Let me ask you, we have covered killer acquisition, we have covered common ownership. You have also I want to draw your attention to now the slightly larger context in which there are two issues I am mentioning for your consideration. One is the coordination between antitrust authority and the sector regulatory authorities. So that's one issue which, in a way, affects the competitive ecosystem. And the second one is the industrial policy, which is determined by the government, either at the federal level or at the state level, right? So at both the levels. So now I am raising a question, and you have in your book mentioned a reform that there needs to be there is a need to educate the judiciary, but I'm stretching that argument a little bit, and I'm asking you: is there a return to education, competition education to other sector regulatory authorities and government officials? Is there a case for that also?
Let me take your last question first, and that is I believe that there is a substantial role that's not been filled for competition to have a place at the table at a number of other sectors and regulators. In the U.S., there was a proposal, which I do not take credit for, but a proposal at one point to install in each of the cabinet offices, environment, interior, agriculture, and the rest, an Office of Competition and Consumer Affairs. And the idea would be to institutionalize the role of competition in each of these agencies. Now, it would not be given, that person or that office would not have formal authority, but it would have a voice at the point where decisions were made that affected competition. Because I, like everyone, is aware of the fact that many of these agencies have a mission that does not include competition as part of their concern, and they are aware in many instances that the policies that they adopt may have competitive effects that they might not have chosen. So that, I think, is consistent with what you're describing, that there is a concern in the U.S., and I suspect, I cannot speak to your country, but I suspect in many countries where many agencies would benefit from insight into the competitive effects of the measures that they're taking. So I think that is an issue well worth pursuing, because I think it would broaden the competition perspective on agency actions. Your other question, I think, had to do with coordination between the competition authority and the sector regulators. Again, I cannot speak to yours, though I was in 2009, I believe, at the relaunch of your competition agency. I spoke about the electricity sector and competition issues in the electricity sector in your country, which I must confess I've not followed thoroughly, but there it is. There were, I believe, 3 or 4 different sectoral competition questions raised and speakers on different ones of them at the time. But in the U.S., where, of course, I'm much more familiar with experience, the relationship between the sector regulator and competition is not always a cooperative one, let us say. It's the Federal Communications Commission and the Justice Department do cooperate on most telecom issues, cable TV, and the wireless and the like, but they have an odd statutory role where the FCC has competition as one of its 6 or 7 objectives in looking at consolidations in the industry. The Justice Department, of course, has competition and only competition as its mission. So they're not always pursuing exactly the same objectives. But those agencies, I think, in recent years have pursued their overlapping missions quite well. That's less true with some other agencies that I think have been less inclined to cooperate with the antitrust agencies. So in the transportation area, without naming names and agencies in the transportation area, and in some other areas, it's not always been the case that the sectoral regulator has welcomed the insight and perspective of the competition agencies. But that, I think, is a failure, not a strength of the U.S. system. And again, by introducing a competition a voice for competition in some of these sectoral regulators as well as the cabinet agencies, I think would help to round that corner and soften the way that the present system works. So, competition is not, as I say, high on the list of concerns from some of the cabinet agencies that I'm familiar with, and it's been a surprise in some instances to them that they inadvertently have adopted policies without understanding that there might be an equally suitable policy that has less of a competitive impact.
Right.
So I do agree with broadening the role and perspective of competition. I think that in 2016, at the very end of the administration of President Obama, there was a Council of Economic Advisors white paper issued in the state of competition in the U.S. economy. And it highlighted a number of the things that we've been talking about, but it also, I think, proposed that competition be more fully embraced throughout the government in a lot of places that normally might not think about competition issues quite so systematically.
Right. Then I think the question posed by Neha Malhotra that you have already answered in your killer acquisition argument, so that I'm not taking up. Sohaib Bande has posed two questions I'm taking up. One has been answered. The second question he has answered that in the case of multi-sided platforms, other than taking into account the cross-network effects to assess market power, how important is the interrelationship of pricing across the platforms as a tool to assess market power?
So the way of analyzing these platforms, and particularly since the two sides operate both separately and interdependently, of course, is a matter of great controversy here in the U.S. and elsewhere. The American Express decision, most obviously, but this and it's a matter of great controversy in the economic sector as well as in the legal sector. So, my own view is that the interdependence between the two needs to be recognized, though there certainly is the ability to exercise market power on one side or the other. In addition, so I think that's not a choice that has to be made to analyze the two sides separately versus together. I think both or all three of those, both the individual two sides as well as the interdependency between the two, is a fair game for analysis on the part of the antitrust agencies. And I say that because price, of course, plays an unusual role in these markets. We're used to getting Google services nominally free. We're used to getting services from Amazon at a nominal charge, if at all. And so we're used to viewing these as essentially free goods. But as economics well understands, they're anything but free. That there is another side to these processes, to these markets, to these platforms. Same is true in the credit card sector and in others as well. And so looking at just one side, looking at it in isolation, sometimes provides insight into the market power question. But it's also, I think, important to recognize, as not all the courts have, that the two sides have an interdependence that needs to be analyzed collectively. Anyway, this is a subject for a much longer conversation, but I think that the questioner has certainly hit upon one of the key issues that remains very much in debate and discussion in the U.S. and elsewhere by the major competition authorities. Here, too, I think there's been considerable deference to the way that these businesses operate. And there's been, and I still see in the popular press, discussions about how we get free goods from many of these tech companies. And of course, that is not an entirely correct and complete way of thinking about their conduct and their potential ability to affect consumer choice and to ultimately to affect prices as well.
Right. And that brings us to the closure of the session. And I want to give you a small little perspective before asking you for your closing remarks. John, in the polls, I asked a question to all the audience. Are you aware about the Competition Act 2002 in India? In India, the statute which governs the competition law was passed in 2002, but actual enforcement started only in 2009. And merger control started only in 2011. So in that sense, at least 10 full years have passed since full competition law was enforced in the country, and a little over when the antitrust provisions were enforced. And I see that about 24% people have responded that they are not aware, and 75% people are aware. So in a way, the point I'm trying to make here is that India and many other developing countries are latecomers in the game of competition law enforcement. Is there a latecomer advantage? Can I say that? If yes, how can developing countries like India and several others in Africa can really capitalize on the latecomer advantage? And more so that particularly at the international forum, I regularly hear phraseologies like mature jurisdictions and new jurisdictions. But actually, the way markets are behaving, I don't know whether there are mature jurisdictions anymore. But over to you for your closing remarks.
So that, of course, is a good question and very apropos to your audience, of course. We don't all start in the same place. And the U.S., of course, has a very long history of competition policy. And it's been enforced in different ways at different times. And so, and my argument in the book is that over the past 25 or 30 years, it's been enforced inadequately. And so I don't believe we're a perfect model. And there may well be a latecomer advantage in some ways. And the ICN, as of course you know, is an institution that's designed to assist countries with smaller countries, newer antitrust missions in developing the expertise and the institutional awareness for how to proceed with some of these things. And so I think that, coming late can avoid some errors and pick up on some good practices. And like I say, I was part of a mission to Delhi in 2009 for the relaunch of your competition agency, and I was pleased to have been able to do that. And I'm aware of the kind of history of your efforts in the competition sector. Of the 100 and I'm not sure what it is, 20 or 30 members of the ICN, it is really the exception, not the rule, that countries have long experiences. 100 of the 120, or whatever the right number may be, really are in a circumstance like yours, where the agencies have begun within the past 10 or 15 years, where the law is still being interpreted by the administrative operations and sometimes the judiciary. So there's much to be learned. That said, I think there are things that are lessons in my book for newer agencies and for newer competition authorities. For example, I think that it's incredibly helpful that the agencies rely on guidelines and presumptions. The reason is that presumptions eliminate the need, if they're well crafted, eliminate the need to reinvent the wheel, as we say. That is, to do an analysis of, for example, mergers that are transparently anti-competitive because they involve mergers between, let's say, two of the remaining three companies or whatever. So presumptions like that are both efficient, because I think they draw the line in an appropriate place, and eliminate the need for agencies to expend energy, resources, and where it's not necessary. Similarly, I think that the more retrospectives are helpful, because the agency would be constantly learning from its own experience and improving its method for going forward. And I think this is true for newer agencies, certainly, as well as for the US, where there's been no systematic program. The CMA in the UK has a program that requires 2 or 3 such to be done by the agency, I think each year, with some oversight as to what mergers and actions are reviewed. But the point is that there is an institutional imperative that they do so. The resource question is important, and as well as the education in modern economics by whatever is the ultimate reviewing authority, whether it's a judiciary or some outside entity. So I think all of that will help to strengthen the foundation and the institutional capabilities of the agency. So these are 5 or 6 of my 12 or 15 prescriptions. And I think both the process and some of the substantive areas that I mentioned are just as applicable to agencies with less background. And in addition, it would help avoid some of the mistakes that perhaps we have fallen into in the US and elsewhere. And if I might offer a final comment, let me reflect on your observation that merger analysis is like astrology. Of course, there is way too much truth to that statement, but I think it's well worth remembering. And I also would invite any of the questioners that we did not have time to accommodate to feel free to email me, and I would be happy to respond to them by email because I appreciate all of the comments and questions, and I wanted to thank you, Navneet, for this opportunity as well.
Thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure to listen to you and your perspective and the freshness you have brought to the discourse of reviving antitrust. And I shall look forward to stay engaged with you on this subject and many others, and would look forward to host you once again, John. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation, posing very thoughtful questions, which have only enriched the deliberation today. Thank you, one and all. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.